The Torah tells us, "Sasar min hadavar asher yagidu lacha yaminu smol." It's the mitzvah to listen to the Chachamim, and the pasuk says right and left. So Rashi quotes the famous Sifri. Certainly, when the rabbis tell you right is right and left is left, you listen to them. But also when the rabbis tell you right is left and left is right, you also have to listen to them. That's the famous Sifri with the Rashi, that you even have to listen to the rabbis when they're telling you left is right and right is left. So, in fact, Herman Wouk, who I think he taught in Yeshiva University for a year, he wrote one of his books, maybe he wrote many, the Cain Mutiny.
Yes.
The Cain, the name of the ship, Mutiny, what happened on the ship.
Yeah.
And basically the case was, it was a psycho captain, he wanted his strawberries a certain way, he liked his steak well done, or whatever the cases may be, and he was going crazy, and the question was, do I have to listen to a captain when he's nuts? So the purpose of the book was to show, even when the captain's always right, even when he's wrong, no matter what, you always follow the captain.
You know, incidentally, they were fighting against Hitler. It was a ship in the Pacific.
Oh, it was against, so he had a good cause, you mean?
Yes.
Okay.
And the lawyer for him at the court-martial said, you know, that Hitler was trying to make soap out of my parents, so listen to the captain.
Oh, so, right. The one who the captain of the ship was Jewish, you mean?
No, I don't think so.
You said he tried to make soap out of my parents?
No, the man, the lawyer.
Oh, the lawyer was saying it, okay.
I remember correctly.
So they point out, so when Herman Wouk was teaching in Yeshiva University for a short time, so he told the students, you know what, I got the title from I got the idea from Rashi and Chumash. Because Rashi says, if the rabbis tell you left is right or right is left, you listen to them, so you listen to a captain no matter what.
Yes.
So one of the Talmidim raised their hands and said, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but that's not the pshat in Rashi. You clearly haven't learned the Ramban. The Ramban points out that Rashi cannot mean that, because there's a famous Mishnah in the beginning of Harios that says that if the Beis Hagadol makes a mistake, and you know they made a mistake, you don't listen to them. So it's clearly rabbinic law is not binding an error, so that's not the pshat in Rashi. Of course, one could say, unlikely that the Sifri and the Mishnah are arguing, that is a possibility, that's not the accepted one. So we assume the Sifri is not going against the Mishnah, unless you wanted to say it's a machokes, so therefore that can't be pshat in Rashi. So I don't think he changed, he kept it to Kami. It might have been after he already wrote his book. He wasn't going to go back and change it. So either way, so how do we reconcile the Sifri? Rashi quotes the Sifri about following the rabbis when left is right, right is left, with the Mishnah Harios, which says if rabbinic psak is not binding, if it's wrong, you don't follow it. So how do we reconcile the two? So the Ramban writes one word. He says the difference, and you have to add one word to the Sifri. It says, if it's nira keinecha, if it appears to you that the rabbis are telling you left is right and right is left, so if you know for sure, if you're a Talmud Chacham, you're a Torah scholar, and you know there's a definite mistake going on here, so then you don't listen to them. But for the average person, the average balabas, the hamunam, who has a little knowledge, and what's the rabbi talking about? He said this and that, you don't really know much. This isn't talk radio. Talk radio, you call in and say, well, I think he should be the MVP, or who's going to win today, how the Jay's going to do. And you're right, you know just as much as the guy on the show. Not too much. So it's okay, you're all entitled to opinion when it comes to talk radio. But lahavdil, let's say when it comes to, Shakespeare or somewhere else, like someone learned Shakespeare for 20 years, and a person read Shakespeare for about 5 minutes, the one with 5 minutes, he doesn't have the same opinion. Everyone has an opinion, but they're going to laugh at him. He says, I think this is pshat in Shakespeare. They'll say, okay, how long have you been learning? 5 minutes? Okay, they'll laugh at him and move on. Somehow when it comes to Torah, people think that they were listening for 2 minutes during Kriyas Torah, they seem to know everything, and therefore they have a whole new pshat. So it's okay to ask questions, just don't think that you're entitled to the same opinion as someone who's been studying for 30, 40 years. So either way, that's what they point out, that the Ramban says, no, if it's near and if you think they're wrong, then okay, good for you. So go get re-educated, go learn some more, and you'll see how they're right. But if a mistake has been made, then we do not follow rabbinical on error. There's a famous explanation from, I think it's a Chassam Sofer. He's from the 4th generation, Rav Moshe Glasner. He's a very independent thinker. And he wanted to make the following distinction between when you follow the rabbis and when you don't, if it looks like it's a mistake. So he wants to say as follows, that there's a famous Gemara in Shabbos. It talks about killing lice. So we all know, let me give you some background, killing people all week long are prohibited. Not allowed to kill people in the Tilas Neshama. Animals during the week, Shchita, speak to Mike, you're allowed to kill animals during the week, but on Shabbos you can't, it's the Tilas Neshama, you violate a malach on Shabbos. However, the Gemara says, killing lice is permitted on Shabbos. So how could it be? Why am I allowed to kill lice? So the Gemara writes, She'enu para rav, in other words, spontaneous generation. Speak to Louis Pasteur. So the Gemara seems to say, because of spontaneous, they grow from schmutz. They don't have a mommy. They disappear from the dirt. So therefore, apparently that seems to be the pshat in the Gemara, and the Rambam seems to go along with it. So how do we reconcile? Louis Pasteur in science refuted that theory. In fact, I think they say when they came out with spontaneous generation, and it was refuted. So that was the whole discussion, because the Russians, who were atheists, so they had to come up with something how did things grow, because they didn't believe. So the people were happy, but they realized that anyway it was nothing to be happy about. You pay someone enough money, they'll come up with a study that you want to hear. So they were paid off, and the Russians got what they wanted. So either way, how do we accept science today that it's not spontaneous generation? So are you allowed to kill lice on Shabbos? I know mommies still want to kill lice on Shabbos on the kids here when they're taking out and they're combing through. So do we accept the halacha even though it seems to be based on erroneous information, because we don't believe in spontaneous generation anymore? So that's what Rav Moshe Glasner. So obviously one approach is that, okay, if the facts are wrong, that's it. So then there are those who say you can no longer kill lice on Shabbos. If the whole reason is based on spontaneous generation, we refuted that, so then we go back to a general principle. Others say no. Others say what the Gemara says remains. How can it say what it remains? Isn't it wrong? So some explain as follows, that they make a distinction. Here's what Rav Moshe Glasner says. The distinction is that, he says it depends. He says, when the Chachamim came up with the laws of, let's say, killing lice on Shabbos, so where did they get that from? So Pashtus, they spoke to the scientists of the day, or they were scientists themselves, and they figured it out on their own. They came to that conclusion, Eino Para Rabba, that spontaneous generation. Yeah. So he says like this, Rav Moshe Glasner. So if the Chachamim, when they came up with the halacha, and they based it on some scientific thing, so if at the time when they came up with it, that was the science of the time, they agreed this is what it is, that the science of the time said spontaneous generation, that was all the science, and then later on it was disproved, then the halacha stays. At the time when they made the halacha, that was the right science. However, if at that time they made the halacha, the science totally disproved what there was. If there never was a belief of spontaneous generation and they just said killing, so then he claims then you wouldn't follow them. So he wants to make a distinction between if at the time when they passed in the Shaila, what they were saying is, in other words, it reminds me of the Chazon Ish a little bit. The Chazon Ish writes that the Chazal tell us there are 6,000 years, before the Mashiach. Yes. So the first 2,000 years are years of Tov Avo, null and void. And then the 2,000 to 4,000 are years of Torah. And 4,000 to 6 are the years of the Mashiach. In fact, that's the whole thing with Rabbi Akiva, the Bar Kokhba rebellion. So in terms of, he thought that he was Becheskes Mashiach. The Chachamim didn't say, grass is going to grow on your head before the Mashiach comes. In other words, he's not the one, and you'll be dead for a long time. But either way, so they point out, so what does that mean? That between 2,000 and 4,000 of the year is the Torah. You mean we're not learning Torah now? So all the Torah going on that doesn't count? No, so the Chazon explains that no, that between the years 2,000 and 4,000 is the year they develop, when they developed the Torah Shabbat Peh and all the principles of the Torah. So the principles were developed then. After the year 4,000, you can't have any new principles. You can take the principles and apply them to future generations like we do all the time, but the principles are set up by Chazal, and those principles don't change. So he claims, in other words, let's say by a treifa. He said, let's say, if the Gemara calls an animal a treifa, the animal is going to die within the year, and science say today the animal is not going to die within the year. So he says you still consider it a treifa because when they were setting up the principles during the year 2000 and 4000, that's not going to change. So he says, so you want to say that distinction, that the distinction is that at the time when they made the halacha, so the science agreed to them, so then even if it changes later on, you still keep the halacha like killing lice, but if it's a mistake, you don't. Others say differently. They know. Like the Rabbi writes, that no. I mean, the Gemara is always right. The question is, but you have to come up with a different reason what the Gemara means. Like the Gemara in Thu Jun talks about a wildcat. When a wildcat attacks an animal, for some reason it dies. The animal, the victim, dies quicker. So they always thought, you know why the Gemara thought? Because of the venom he gets into the body, and that's why they do. But then we found out later on they don't have any venom. So he said, okay, great. So let's look to modern science to find out what the reason is. The halacha doesn't change, but we have to go and we have to study more. So the reason is because they bite this much deeper, and the dirt gets into the wound, and that's why you get an infection. So in other words, you're right. So the reason might change then if it's based on science. So that's what we need moderns to find out. What's the pshat? But once the Gemara is passed, you have to come back and try to figure out what the Gemara is saying. Or Rav Shlomo Zalman, he has a different pshat with the Gemara, with the lice. He says that in general, let's say by bugs, the bugs are usher to eat, but they have to be visible. Right. So he points out, let's say there's halacha by mushrooms. What bracha do you make on mushrooms? To make a shahako. What about a boer piyadam? Don't they grow from the ground? So they grow in the ground, but Chazal tell us that they get the nourishment from the air around the ground. But if you look at the scientists will tell me that they get the nourishment from the ground. So what Allah is saying is, of course, there is some nourishment from the ground, but it's not considered enough of nourishment that we consider it coming from the ground. Halachically speaking, we view the nourishment from the air, even though there is some nourishment from the ground, but it's not enough to warrant a boer piyadama. So he's saying, it's not the rabbis knew. Of course they knew there wasn't spontaneous generation. But they're saying these bugs were so small that we're not consider them as growing bugs normally with mommy and children. Yeah, but that's why we consider it. But it's not that they didn't know it. It's saying, halachically speaking, they didn't view them, they're too small, and therefore they weren't accepted as the regular para or rava. So that's the pshat. So to summarize, we had the famous Kasha, we had the famous Rashi, that, and quoting the Sifri, that the rabbis tell you left is right, and right is left, you follow them. It means rabbinic law binding in Eric, there can't be, because the Mishnah says in Harios, that if Beis Din Agadol makes a mistake, you don't follow them. If you know that the Beis Din made a mistake, you have to bring karbanos, everything, so how can we reconcile? So we had the Ramban. It's only near it. If you think they made a mistake, then don't worry about it. They know more than you. You're the one making the mistake, not them. And you follow them. If you know for sure, if you're a Talmud Chacham, you know there was a mistake made, then clearly you don't follow it. You have Rav Moshe Glasner saying depends where the mistake was. If when they made the psak that went together with the original science and the cutting edge science was an agreement, he says that like the chazish and the halacha stays, even though the science was disproven. Or you have Rav Dessler saying no, the Gemara is always whatever the psak of the Gemara always stays. But you're right, if the Gemara gave a reason, that reason was based on what the science at the time, then you have to go come up another reason why the halacha is intact. Or Rav Shlomo Zalman in the case here, they weren't considered It's not that they thought spontaneous generation. They knew it wasn't, but it was because it was so small. So they said "Eino para rava," but it was like the mushrooms. They realized it came from the ground, but halachically speaking, the main nourishment came from the air and not the ground. It's getting blocked off.